So I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to try to share my screen again. um, Hopefully um, you have read Practice Ended Theory starting at the bottom of page 19 and continuing over to page 21. And if you did not, please do that now before, and then come back and watch part 4. So in this slide, it's a look at 3 of the developmental issues and what we believe about those today. And I'm going to try to move really quickly through this part 4, but I want you to pay particular attention and add this to your notes. Like this slide says, current developmental research provides evidence that both nature and nurture influence most behavioral outcomes. That is very important that you understand that we believe today that both nature and nurture influence most behavioral outcomes. So the modern multidimensional view believes that heredity and environment are interdependent, but now we have researchers who are trying to figure out how they work together, first of all, and to what degree each behavior or personality trait is influenced by each one. And I have to tell you that I have always been a great believer that nurture was more important than genetics, but I had a family member who was not raised by one parent and actually had no contact with that parent, and was not even in a family where, you know, sometimes they may not have contact with that family, but there's so much of, oh my gosh, that's just like your dad, or that's just like your mom every time they do something wrong, that they really might as well be raised with them. And that was not the truth. It was like that parent just went away and was never discussed again. And yet, I actually knew both the parent and the child. And as I watched the child grow into adulthood, I saw more and more just really odd things that they both had in common. They liked the same foods, even though they really would not have, should not have normally. They had, they liked the same hair color in women, even though it was not the hair color that the other person had liked younger. They drove the same kind of vehicles, even though the child didn't know the parent drove that kind of vehicle or had ever drove that kind of vehicle. So there's just some things that you see that you're like, yeah, that definitely, even in personality traits, that is influenced by genetics. So neuroplasticity, which is our second bullet there, refers to changes in the brain that are the result of some practice or experience. And neurons become reorganized as a result of that practice, resulting in new learning and memory. And so we will talk about that more when we talk about young children, because they have a lot of that going on at that time. But current scientists believes that there's no periods in life, none, not even the elderly, when the brain and its functions are static. Changes are continuous throughout the lifespan. And so what type of change, as well as the amount of change, depends on genetic and environmental factors working together. And so the realization that our brains continue to change throughout life has really revolutionized the way scientists regard the brain. There was a time that they believed we were born with all the neurons we were ever going to have, and that we didn't make any more neurons, and that we sure didn't make any more neurons after adulthood. But we now know that we continue to replicate those neurons throughout our life. Even it does slow down generally in older adults, but that they still regenerate. So a time-related variation by region and function is at the heart of the classical questions about critical or sensitive periods. And although the brain exhibits plasticity throughout life, researchers agree that there are some things that it is much easier to acquire during those sensitive periods, like learning to walk or speech. It's easier to acquire speech before the age of about 5 or 6. And if that acquisition is missed for some reason, research has shown that the individual can acquire it later, but it's never learned as well or as effortlessly. And we see that fairly rarely. You know, there have been cases. There have been cases throughout history, but we know that babies are born with the ability to form all the 600 phonemes or sounds that are possible in any of our languages. But if they don't exercise that ability, then they lose the ability to form the sounds that they don't use over those first few years. And yes, they can learn them, but they may sound like me when I try to speak Spanish. I know the words, but when they come out of my mouth, my R's don't roll. And I have been able to speak Spanish for many years. I'm not very fluent anymore because I don't speak Spanish very much. But at no point did I ever sound like that was my native language, because I learned it as an adult, as a teenager, and as an adult. So, and that's not true just with spoken language. So if a deaf child doesn't learn ASL before school age, they may learn it later, but they won't have the same degree of fluency as someone who learned it earlier in life. And we do see that quite a bit, just because sometimes the caregivers may not even realize that they're deaf initially, so, or that they have a hearing challenge. So especially with the grammar part of it, they're probably not ever going to be as fluent as someone who learned it earlier. And so researchers tend to believe that this is because of time-dependent, region-specific windows of opportunity for rapid neural reorganization that changes the brain. And so that makes the learning less easy after that sensitive period is passed. And so, yep, you can learn it, but it just may not be as easy. So developmental science is concerned with explaining the nature and characteristics of change, and they also recognize that much older research was less attuned to race and culture. I mean, we know that there was a huge amount of research that was strictly done with white male samples. And that was because that was what was available to them. And so there was no thoughts about whether or not that would be the same for other races and genders and ethnicities. So researchers have become acutely aware of the need to discover how developmental processes play out among other groups. And they've done a lot in the developmental area, more than in some other areas. And they've done that within groups that are both within and outside of the North America area, because they want to be able to answer those questions about universal versus specific developmental trajectories. When I teach research, a lot of times I would have students who would use a study from Africa or New Zealand, or to discuss something that happened in schools, and that's okay, or something that happened developmentally, but it needed to be stated that it was from a different culture, from a different area, because it may not be universal. It may be specific to that area, if that makes sense. So because of this, culture and race and ethnicity now have a much greater prominence in research than in the past. even though these constructs have really proven pretty difficult to define because, well, there's many reasons for this, but one of the most important one here in the United States is that many people in the United States don't belong to just one culture. And when they're asked what their ethnicity is, and you know that ethnicity and culture are not necessarily the same, but a lot of times instead of asking about their culture, studies will ask about their ethnicity. And so let me give you an example. My daughter is half Mexican. If you ask her for her ethnicity on a form, you're usually not allowed to put multiple ethnicities, although I have no idea why not, because we are not, most of us, just one ethnicity today. So she will almost always choose Mexican or Hispanic, whatever that choice is. But she spent very little time with her Hispanic family and their culture. And so while she would identify in a research project as Hispanic, her answers would actually be more closely aligned to my culture, which is really pretty more much the majority culture of European America. So, I mean, that is some of the issues that they run into, and I believe it's one that they're going to continue to run into until we change the way that we ask some of those questions. So what does this mean to you as a practitioner, as a counselor, as an administrator for a school, as a teacher, whatever your particular role or career is going to be? The value of developmental knowledge is just personal. It is just phenomenal. It is so important to every adult, in my opinion. But for practitioners, it allows you to bring an important perspective to your practice. Actually, several elements: a sensitivity to the fact that people grow and change over the life course, that who they were when they were young may change significantly over the course of their life. Although, by the way, there are some personality traits that do not change over the course of the life unless there is some kind of interruption, some kind of a trauma or something that changes that. So, like people who are very active in their young years may also be very active in their older years. It may just be the level of activity that you would expect of an older person would, of course, decrease, and they may no longer jump on a trampoline, they may run marathons, or they may hike, or they may do something like that, if that makes sense. So there are some things that stay the same. A sensitivity to the fact that people grow and change over the life course, a recognition of the influence of culture and environment over time. And you remember that we said that that's more important in adults than it is in children. And an appreciation for scientific knowledge about development, and a commitment to applying that scientific knowledge to improve the lives of people across the lifespan that you are interacting with. It also sets the stage of effective prevention and intervention of problems, because if you're basing your interventions just on your own personal knowledge, then that is not as effective as if you have information about what would be typical for that particular age group from large research studies. Developmentally sensitive research can identify periods within the lifespan and intra-individual variables that allow opportunities for both interventions which will have maximum impact. So knowing these things can allow you to have a more impact than if you're just trying to make it without any kind of scientific research behind you. And it also leads to a more personalized care because it emphasizes both the individual and the cultural differences. And so a culturally competent practice is now considered the standard for performance across many helping professions, including counseling. You know, we've all heard that Native American children don't look you in the eye. Well, we now know that in some instances, in some cultural situations, that's true, that they don't look adults or persons of authority in the eye, but that can vary um, from tribe to tribe or from area to area. So it's just important to know as much as you can. But anybody who tells you that they are a culturally competent counselor, I would be concerned about that, because most of us are still evolving. And, you know, it's very difficult to learn about other cultures. And it takes a huge amount of tenacity on our part and a huge amount of sensitivity on our part to learn and respect other cultures. So the gap between research and practice that you learned about on pages 3 through 5 may be really important to revisit at this point. A robust research practice relationship, excuse me, offers benefits to both parties. So researchers need that relationship with clinicians to do their research, and clinicians need that research to guide the quality of their interventions and improve the quality of care that they provide. So that relationship can be a very important one for you as a practitioner. So I'm going to let me talk just a little bit more though about why we need to know these things. So as a member of a helping profession, you need to understand why science is helpful to you, which that is because it allows you to base your decisions for treatment on scientific data derived from research studies that allow you to use empirically based prevention and treatment to be an informed consumer of information about a program or a practice. And I have to tell you, when you are trying to get informed information about a program or a practice, a salesperson is not the person to provide that, or an editor. So you want to look for peer-reviewed publications. And I focus on this a lot with my research students, and I'm sure that whoever your professor will focus on that a lot when you take the research class. But you need to make sure that your research is, first of all, valid research that's based on good data. And that is the purpose of this program. Having a research class is so that you can learn to become good, informed consumers of research and know what constitutes good research. When you hear a commercial on TV that says, 9 out of 10 dentists recommend blah, 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 do you realize that they really may have only asked 10 dentists and they would be able to say that and it would be legitimate? So it's important to know what the sample size was, what the population was for different studies, especially since those 10 dentists might be getting that free whatever the blah was in truckloads. And so if I was to emphasize anything in regards to research, it would be that you become a informed consumer. Get your research from peer-reviewed articles, not from a salesperson, not from a curriculum. If you're using a peer-reviewed journal article, then you can be sure that at least their peers who have knowledge in that area feel like they followed ethical guidelines and conditions in reporting on their research. Does that make sense? And really, even on reputable sites like Psychology Today, I love to be on Psychology Today and read their articles, but those may simply be one person's opinion if they're not a peer-reviewed journal article. So you still want to be careful even in those areas. And if you're feeling like that you maybe need more information about what constitutes a good source, then I'd be glad to discuss that further with you guys, or set up a Zoom meeting with the librarian and let her discuss it. So I'm going to go ahead and end theories here. I could talk forever about theories because I do think they're so important, but we will talk about each of these again. Make sure that you finish your assignment over theories, and that you not only finish that assignment, but that you keep it, because you will want to review it, especially if this is one of your first classes in the program. You'll want to review that before you take your certification test. But this is the last section on theories, and I appreciate so much you guys listening to me.